Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Storyforming. Today I want to do another round. It has a couple of interesting things that I found in it, so let's dive right in. First thing I want to talk about is the fact that it is a holistic story structure, which means that the way that everything is put together, the way that scenes relate to one another, is through relationships and through the balancing of those relationships, not necessarily a cause and effect. This happened, and because of that, then this happened. That would be something that's more shaped around reason. This one is shaped around relationships. So what that means is if you're watching the film and if you're somewhat more like me and you can empathize or feel more a part of a linear or reason-based story, then something that's relationship oriented, you might tend to get bored in places. The performances are amazing, everything's great, but after a while, you'll start to think, what's the point of this story? Like, where's it going? When will I know it's over? And the reason why that's a different experience is because the story itself is just an experience. It's not something about problem solving. It's about the experience of directing your life through different balances and managing inequities. And so at the end, there really isn't a goal that you achieve. It's more of a direction that the story takes. Is there a sense of composure? Is it something a little less than that, where it's just about being present and then in the moment? Is it something that's a little more stagnant, or does it completely disconnect? In another round, when he's dancing around and he's relieved all the stress and gotten to a place where he's much more happier than he was in the beginning. He was completely depressed. If there's one thing that's fantastic through the whole film, it's obviously Mads Mikkelsen's performance, because you actually get to see what it feels like to be somebody in a state of complete depression who just does not care about anything, but is actually able to pull themselves out of it by drinking. That's the crazy part that I want to get into, is that the actual argument of the story, the premise, actually advocates for binge drinking. And we'll get to how it actually does that, but he pulls himself out of that by letting his inhibitions go and getting back to that feeling of when they were young, which is why that juxtaposition of the race around the lake in the beginning, that's the whole point of the story, is to get back to that youthful exuberance just by letting your inhibitions go and using drink as a means of getting there. Here in America, that would be, for the most part, the Puritan aspect of that might be shunned upon, but it's really nice to see that play out in a different culture and a different idea of how things fit together. And then the other part of the story form that I thought was interesting is he does start out extremely depressed. Martin does. He's in a completely depressed place and doesn't really care about anything. And by the end, he has gone to a place where he's happy again and joyful and dancing around, and he's able to break out and do the whole jazz ballet thing. Most people, when they would look at that growth of character from beginning to end, would think that it's an indication of the character changing their resolve, as if now they are doing things differently. Because, yeah, he was sad in the beginning and now he's happy at the end. So obviously he's changed. But if you really think about it, all he's doing throughout the entire story is letting himself be driven by his feelings, whether or not those feelings are in a depressed state, whether or not they are in a elevated state at the end, he's still taking the same path by virtue of the fact that he's keen into his emotions and letting that drive whatever he does. The point of the premise is actually to communicate a change of direction through growth, not through balancing things and juggling things to the point where that's what you always have to do to maintain this sort of thing. But it's really about growing. His resolve from beginning to end, it does grow into those emotions and they do get stronger, but he's always coming from that place. And something that's interesting, when you do switch the point of the premise away from something that's balanced, and that's what gets you this composed sort of feeling, when you switch and you think of the purpose of the premise to communicate growth, then what you're really looking at is transcendence. And that feels much better for the dance at the end. And of course, the leap at the end as well. He's transcended his depression. That is the difference between a changed resolve coming from a holistic perspective and a steadfast resolve coming from a holistic mindset, is that instead of just composure, where you're like composed between two things, you're transcending it by growing into it. And that's the direction that it takes. So I thought those two things were really interesting. And that's the crazy part about the premise is that it's not just about finding a way to balance drinking and all this other stuff. It's more just running with your feelings. Right? So that's what he is going for from the very beginning to the very end, is to really just let your inhibitions go. And so what happens is the conflict in the story, the work that's going on in the story, is a juxtaposition of letting your inhibitions go, of being free, and then, of course, control on the other end. Now, if we go up here and look at the personality of the story, one thing that's absolutely clear is that Martin is dealing with depression, and we get the experience of depression more so than anybody else in the entire story. What he's dealing with personally are the subconscious concerns. He doesn't really care about his students, isn't really into it, and of course, the sadness and the depression, that's all subconscious. The objective story, the plot of the story, is about obtaining. Now, in a holistic story, you don't really focus on objective story goals. You really look much more at the issues underneath. And so if we look down here, this issue of self-interest, it's not that it's a bad thing to think about self-interest. So most American Western stories couch self-interest as a negative thing. I just did a Storyform for Young Guns, which is a Western from 1988, and it has the same issue of self-interest, but it's much more about all the negative aspects of people being selfish and getting revenge and all that stuff. Here, in Another Round, you get another look at what self-interest is as a thematic issue, as something good. And especially here, this is just an automatic storytelling illustration that came up. But thinking about one's own interests in terms of self-interest is actually a good thing in the context of this story. So that's why it's interesting. The premise is arguing for not only, hey, binge drinking is good because it lets your inhibitions go. That's right here, the being in harmony with being free and letting inhibitions go. I probably put inhibitions. Yeah. So being in harmony with being uninhibited, just like letting go, allows your issues with thinking about your own interests. Hey, I can't connect with my wife. I don't have a girlfriend. I'm feeling lonely. My wife doesn't talk to me anymore. She's always gone. I can't connect with my kids. I don't care about my job. All that stuff. If you continue to be in harmony with allowing yourself to be uninhibited through binge drinking, you can allow your issues of self-interest and not thinking about your own interests help you heal and transcend. And while it's sad for his one friend that happens to go out on the boat, for the most part, most of them get to a place where they actually heal themselves and move beyond just by virtue of going through this experiment. And that's why, even though the narrative is structured around relationships, it's not really about the dysfunctional aspects of their relationships. They get along great. And in fact, the relationship story is between all of them, basically drinking buddies, and how they can transform their lives, how they can make themselves different people and supporting each other in that concept or in that intention. Whereas the objective story is really just the experiment of going through there and following the different steps and writing the paper. Think of obtaining as steering the ship, like directing your life in a certain direction. And then the influence character, which is downplayed tremendously in this, is his wife. She has a completely different set of concerns. She's much more concerned about the future. She's always gone. This would be in the universe domain, so where she is problematic, and the fact that they've been married so long. What happens in a narrative is when you have a steadfast main character resolve, the influence character is the one who has the 180-degree turn. And in this story, the character that has the biggest turn is his wife. And usually what happens is that influence character change happens off screen. It's like something that character decides, and then all of a sudden, out of the blue, they come back and say, hey, things are better, which is exactly what happens in this story. So when you choose free here as the direction that he would be going in, what happens is these are the character arcs of Martin and Annika, of the main character and his wife. So here, completely driven by his feelings from beginning to end. In the beginning, it's a very depressed state of emotion. At the end, it's a very elevated, uplifted state of emotion. And then, quite simply, his wife is always avoiding him, always spending time away from him, doing extra turns at the night shift. And at the end, she's actually finally pursuing him. So it's a very simple change, but a complete different change in direction. Instead of running away, I can't do this, she actually approaches him, and he's able to heal and transcend his marriage by embracing that uninhibited feeling. So those are the big aspects that I wanted to go through when it comes to the story form for another round. If I clicked build this story in subtext, what would happen is it would come into here and it would build this story right here. So being in harmony with letting inhibitions go allows your issues with thinking about one's own interests to help you heal and transcend. So this is one that I already built. And you can see here it's got the relationships, the growth, and then the transcendence. That's the direction that the story takes. You have the four perspectives. Martin here is the main character. Annika is the influence character. The drinking buddies, that's the relationship, the heart of the story. They support each other. And then, of course, the objective story, that experiment, is essentially taking control of your boring and stale life. And so when you do that and you go through, you'll see that the intention of obtaining this is instead of a goal is to direct their lives towards greater self-improvement through binge drinking. And Martin represents what it's like to be free, and Annika represents what it's like to be in control or to direct it a certain way. And that's the story form. The complete story form you can see here down at the bottom. You can go see this on subtext, just search for another round, and you can see all the different story points that go into this and build up the narrative. So while this is the actual premise of the story, the specific details of it are all wrapped up into this aspect here, where you have his growth from the four signposts, the four acts. He moves from subconscious to preconscious to conscious to memory. So that's basically complete depression to just numbing himself out to greater reflection, consideration, and then finally he remembers the entire dance. I thought that was beautiful. He's got a critical flaw of his obligations, like school. That's when things get really bad. Hey, you're supposed to be a great teacher. And then just this like dream of being able somehow to bring back what was in that marriage. And he's always in a dreamy state. That's his unique ability, what allows them to help direct and steer the objective story towards that positive aspect. The way he's able to help direct everything to there is that dreamy state. Of course, his wife challenges him with her choices of what she does. Her attitude, that aloof attitude, lessens her impact on him. She's always putting him off. That's the issue of delay. Talked about how she moved from avoidance to pursuit. Of course, she doesn't feel like she's supported at home and she's rejecting what it is that he's doing. That's that support to oppose, the resistance to the flow of that. And then I thought this was really great too, the relationship story between the drinking buddies. They're all about transforming themselves and who's really committed to it and who's really not. And then the condition of their relationship is this temptation to overdo it, to overdrink. It looks like Martin really doesn't want to have a drink, almost as if at the very beginning that he's had a problem before, and so they're like letting him do his own thing. But then the way that they come closer together is to embrace that temptation. It's actually seen as a good thing. The catalyst in their relationship is responsibility. I think that works great at the end with the friend that goes a little too far. And then Martin kind of takes responsibility for him and then adjusts. Hey, that's enough. Let's get a little bit of conscience in here. And then anytime, I think this is really downplayed, but anytime any one of them denies that they have a problem or something, that would lessen their relationship. They wouldn't be able to grow as much as they could. I think this is a beautiful story form. It's very different than what we get here in America. The narrative is fantastic, the way it's played out in the film itself. If you find yourself finding it hard to concentrate like me, has everything to do with that holistic mindset. And just know that you're going along for the experience of it and seeing the world through a different set of eyes. That's it for Storyforming Another Round. If you have any questions about how all of this works together, please feel free to contact me, and I'll see you next time.